The grey waters of the Mediterranean stretched endlessly beneath the wings of the British fighters, cold and unforgiving, mirroring the tension that gripped every pilot's heart that morning. It was May 1941, and the skies above this ancient sea had become a deadly chessboard where nations wagered the fate of empires with blood and courage. The HMS Ark Royal, Britain's most formidable aircraft carrier, cut through the waves with purpose, her deck a hive of controlled chaos as mechanics made final checks and pilots received their briefing. What none of them knew as they climbed into their cockpits that day was that they were about to write a new chapter in naval aviation history, a moment that would be studied in military academies for generations to come. If this story of courage and tactical brilliance captivates you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales from history that shaped our world. Lieutenant Commander Michael Davies stood on the flight deck of the HMS Ark Royal, the salt spray stinging his face as he watched his squadron prepare for what intelligence suggested would be a routine patrol. The morning sun was just beginning to burn through the Mediterranean mist, casting long shadows across the carrier's deck. Davies was 32 years old, a veteran of countless missions, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many nights planning operations and too few hours of sleep. His hands, calloused from years of gripping control sticks, fidgeted with the zipper of his flight suit as he reviewed the mission parameters one final time. The intelligence officer, a young man named Peters, who couldn't have been more than 25, approached with a folder clutched tightly against his chest. His face was pale, and Davies immediately recognized the look of someone carrying bad news. "They've spotted something, sir," Peters said, his voice barely audible above the roar of engines being tested nearby. Long-range reconnaissance indicates a significant force of enemy aircraft heading toward the convoy we're protecting. The estimates are 18 Junkers 87 dive bombers, possibly more. Davies felt his stomach tighten. The Stuka, as the Junkers 87 was known, had earned a fearsome reputation across Europe. These dive bombers had terrorized ground forces during the Battle of France and had proven devastatingly effective against naval targets. Their distinctive inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear made them instantly recognizable, but it was their screaming sirens, the Jericho trumpets, that struck terror into the hearts of those who heard them. Designed specifically to create psychological warfare, the sound of a diving Stuka was said to be the last thing many soldiers ever heard. "How many fighters do we have ready?" Davies asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be what he hoped. Peters consulted his notes, his hands trembling slightly. "We have 12 Fairey Fulmars ready for immediate launch, sir. 3 more could be ready in 20 minutes, but by then the Stukas will already be in attack position." Davies nodded grimly. The Fairey Fulmar was a capable aircraft, sturdy and reliable, but it was designed primarily as a reconnaissance fighter, not a pure interceptor. It was slower than most enemy fighters and carried a crew of 2, the pilot and a radio operator gunner, which added weight but also provided additional eyes and defensive capability. "Get everyone in the briefing room immediately," Davies ordered. "We're launching in 15 minutes. As Peters hurried away, Davies took one last look at the gray horizon. Somewhere out there, 18 enemy pilots were converging on their position, each one intent on sending British ships to the bottom of the Mediterranean. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. The convoy they were protecting carried supplies vital to the North African campaign, thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and provisions that could turn the tide of the Desert War. Losing these ships wasn't an option. In the cramped briefing room below deck, 12 pilots gathered quickly, their faces showing a mixture of determination and apprehension. Davies recognized each man, knew their strengths and weaknesses, had trained with most of them. There was Lieutenant James Hartford, only 23 years old, but already showing the instincts of a natural-born fighter pilot. Beside him sat Flight Officer Thomas Wright, the oldest member of the squadron at 38, a veteran of the Great War who had returned to service when this new conflict began. Sub-Lieutenant Peter Morrison, fresh-faced and eager, sat in the front row, his leg bouncing nervously as he waited for the briefing to begin. "Gentlemen," Davies began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, "we have incoming bandits, 18 Junkers, 87 dive bombers heading directly for our convoy. Intelligence suggests they'll reach attack position within the hour. Our mission is simple in concept, but difficult in execution. We must intercept them before they can begin their attack runs on our ships." The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation sinking in. 18 against 12. The odds weren't terrible, but they weren't good either, especially considering the Stukas would likely have fighter escorts, though reconnaissance hadn't confirmed that yet. "The Stuka's weakness is its speed," Davies continued, pointing to a diagram of the German dive bomber on the wall. "They're heavily armored and carry significant bomb loads, which makes them slow and less maneuverable in level flight. However, once they enter their dive, they're incredibly difficult to intercept. Our window of opportunity is before they begin their attack runs. We need to break up their formation, force them to jettison their bombs early, and prevent them from achieving the precision they need to hit our ships. Hartford raised his hand. What about fighter escorts, sir? The intelligence is unclear, Davies admitted. We have to assume they'll have some Messerschmitt protection, possibly 109s. If that's the case, half of us will need to engage the escorts while the other half goes after the bombers. I'll make the call once we have visual contact. The pilots filed out to their aircraft, each man lost in his own thoughts. The deck crew had worked with remarkable efficiency, and all 12 Fulmars were fueled, armed, and ready for launch. The mechanics, many of them teenagers from small towns across Britain, worked with practiced precision, making final checks on control surfaces and weapon systems. Davies climbed into his cockpit, his radio operator, Sergeant Robert Ellis, settling into the seat behind him. Ellis was a quiet man from Manchester, 30 years old, with a wife and 2 children waiting for him back home. He'd shown Davies photos just the night before, 2 little girls with their mother's smile. The launch sequence began with the characteristic controlled chaos of carrier operations. The deck officer, using colored paddles, guided each aircraft into position. The ship turned into the wind to provide maximum lift for the heavily loaded fighters. One by one, the Fulmars roared down the deck, their engines screaming as they clawed for altitude. Davies felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as his own aircraft left the deck, the brief moment of uncertainty as the plane dropped slightly before the wings caught the air and lifted them skyward. Below, the Ark Royal shrank rapidly, becoming just another gray shape in an endless expanse of blue. "Form up on me," Davies called over the radio, his voice crackling through the static. The squadron assembled quickly into a loose formation, climbing steadily toward their patrol altitude of 12,000 feet. The Mediterranean spread out below them like a wrinkled blue cloth, dotted here and there with the white wakes of the convoy's ships. Davies could see the freighters and their escort destroyers, small and vulnerable from this height, completely dependent on the men flying above them for protection. "Contact," Ellis called from behind him, his voice tight with tension. Bearing 270, range approximately 20 miles, altitude 11,000 feet. Davies' heart began to pound harder. 20 miles. They had perhaps 10 minutes before the engagement began. "All aircraft, this is leader," he transmitted. "Enemy aircraft spotted, bearing 270. Maintain formation and prepare to engage. Remember your training and watch your spacing." The radio crackled with acknowledgments, each pilot confirming he'd received the order. As they closed the distance, the enemy formation became visible, dark specks against the lighter sky, growing larger with every passing second. Davies counted them quickly. 18 Stukas, just as intelligence had reported, flying in 3 groups of 6. His experienced eye immediately noted their formation, tight and disciplined, designed to maximize their mutual defensive fire. But something was wrong. Where were the escorts? Surely the Germans wouldn't send 18 valuable dive bombers on such a critical mission without fighter protection. "Ellis," Davies called back, "do you see any escorts? Keep scanning the sky above them." His radio operator's response came quickly. "Negative, sir. No contacts above or behind the main formation. It doesn't make sense." Davies agreed, but had no time to puzzle over the mystery. Perhaps the escort had turned back due to fuel limitations, or maybe they'd been diverted to another mission. Whatever the reason, the British pilots had been handed an unexpected advantage. "All aircraft," Davies transmitted. "No enemy fighters detected. We're going after the bombers. Alpha Flight, you're with me. We'll take the lead formation. Bravo Flight, engage the center group. Charlie Flight, hit the trailing bombers. Attack from above and behind. Aim for the engines. Break them up before they can begin their dive." The acknowledgments came back quickly, the pilots' voices showing the strain of adrenaline and anticipation. The distance closed rapidly now. Davies could make out individual details of the Stukas, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable. The inverted gull wings, the fixed landing gear with its characteristic fairings, the greenhouse canopy. He knew from intelligence reports that each bomber carried a crew of 2, pilot and gunner, and was loaded with a single 500-kilogram bomb plus 4 smaller bombs on wing racks. In the hands of a skilled crew, the Stuka was devastatingly accurate, capable of placing its bomb within yards of a target. "Here we go," Davies muttered, pushing his control stick forward and adjusting his throttle. The Fulmar nosed down slightly, gaining speed as they approached attack position. The lead Stuka formation was directly ahead now, perhaps 2,000 yards away. He could see the rear gunners swiveling their weapons, tracking the approaching British fighters. In seconds, they'd be in range of defensive fire. The sky erupted with tracers as the German gunners opened fire, streams of bright orange and red bullets arcing toward the British fighters. Davies jinked left, then right, varying his approach to make himself a more difficult target. The Stuka gunners were good, their fire disciplined and accurate, but the relative closing speed made precision difficult. Davies selected his target, the rightmost bomber in the lead group, and centered it in his gun sight. His thumb hovered over the firing button on his control stick. Wait, he coached himself, narrowing the distance. The Fulmer's 8 Browning machine guns were effective, but their effective range was shorter than he'd like. He needed to be close enough to ensure hits on vital areas. The Stuka grew larger in his windscreen, filling his view. He could see the pilot's helmet, the gunner tracking him desperately with his twin machine guns. 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards. Now. Davies' thumb pressed the firing button and the Fulmar shuddered as all 8 guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was deafening even through his leather helmet, a hammering roar that shook the entire aircraft. Tracers streaked toward the Stuka, and he saw strikes on the bomber's engine cowling in right wing. Pieces of metal flew off the German aircraft, glinting in the sunlight as they tumbled away. The Stuka pilot reacted immediately, braking hard right and diving, trying to escape the murderous fire. But Davies stayed with him, adjusting his aim, walking his fire across the bomber's fuselage. More hits sparkled along the Stuka's spine, and suddenly thick black smoke began pouring from its engine. The bomber shuddered, its dive steepening uncontrollably. Davies broke off, looking for his next target, but kept one eye on the damaged Stuka. It continued down, trailing smoke like a funeral shroud, until it impacted the sea in a massive spray of white water. He felt no satisfaction, only grim acknowledgement that the enemy crew had been doing their duty just as he was doing his. The sky had become a whirling chaos of aircraft, tracer fire, and smoke. Davies saw Hartford's Fulmar pursuing another Stuka, firing in short, controlled bursts. The German pilot was good, jinking and weaving, but Hartford stayed with him patiently, conserving ammunition, waiting for the perfect shot. When it came, the effect was dramatic. The Stuka's canopy shattered, and the bomber suddenly nosed over into a vertical dive, spinning as it fell. There was no parachute. "Leader, this is Bravo 2, a voice crackled urgently over the radio. "I've got engine trouble, oil pressure dropping. I'm breaking off." Davies recognized Wright's voice, the older pilot keeping his composure despite his aircraft's mechanical failure. "Acknowledged. Bravo 2, Davies replied. "Head back to the ship. Watch your altitude." He watched as Wright's Fulmar peeled away from the fight, trailing a thin stream of white smoke. That left them with 11 against the remaining Stukas. But the German formation was breaking apart. The coordinated attack they'd planned was in shambles, the tight formations scattered across the sky as individual bombers tried to evade their attackers or position themselves for attack runs on the convoy below. Davies saw 3 Stukas beginning to roll into their characteristic steep dives, their pilots apparently deciding that pressing home the attack was their best chance of survival. He keyed his radio immediately. "Charlie Flight, 3 bandits diving toward the convoy. Intercept if you can." 3 Fulmars peeled away from the main engagement, diving steeply to catch the attacking Stukas. But Davies knew they were in a race against time. The Stuka's dive was steep, nearly vertical, and once established in their attack run, the German pilots were notoriously difficult to deter. They would hold their dive until the last possible moment before releasing their bombs and pulling up, accepting terrible risks to ensure accuracy. Morrison, the young pilot Davies had worried about, was one of the 3 pursuing the diving Stukas. Davies watched, his hands tight on his controls, as Morrison's Fulmar plummeted after the German bombers. The range closed rapidly, too rapidly. Morrison was diving nearly as steeply as the Stukas themselves, pushing his aircraft to its limits. "Come on, kid," Davies muttered. "Pull up, you're too close." But Morrison held his dive, firing long bursts that connected with the trailing Stuka. The German bomber's dive wavered, smoke beginning to pour from its engine, but still it continued down toward the ships below. At the last possible second, perhaps 500 feet above the water, Morrison pulled up hard. The Fulmar's wings flexed dangerously under the G-forces, and for a heart-stopping moment, Davies thought the aircraft would come apart. But it held together, climbing away from the water as the damaged Stuka behind it released its bomb wildly, the weapon splashing harmlessly into the sea 200 yards from the nearest ship. The Stuka pilot tried to pull up, but had waited too long. The bomber struck the water at a shallow angle, cartwheeling violently before disintegrating in a cloud of spray and debris. Morrison's Fulmar continued climbing, rejoining the fight, but Davies could see damage on its left wing, possibly from return fire or structural stress from the violent maneuver. "Morrison, this is Leader. What's your status?" Davies called. The young pilot's response came back breathless but steady. "Minor damage, sir. Port wing has some buckling, but controls are responsive. I can continue." Davies made a quick decision. "Negative, Morrison. Return to the ship. You've done your part." There was a pause, and Davies could imagine the young pilot's disappointment, but the response was professional. "Acknowledged, Leader. Heading home." The engagement had now lasted nearly 15 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter to Davies. The adrenaline made time behave strangely, compressing some moments and stretching others. He'd lost track of exactly how many Stukas had been downed, but a quick scan of the skies showed significantly fewer German bombers than had started the engagement. He counted perhaps 8 or 9 Stukas still airborne, all scattered and trying to either escape or position for attack runs. "Ellis," Davies called to his radio operator, "give me a count on ammunition remaining." There was a brief pause as Ellis checked their gun status. "Approximately 40% remaining, sir." "We've got maybe 2 good engagements left before we're Winchester." Davies nodded, though Ellis couldn't see him. They needed to make every burst count. He selected another target, a Stuka that was trying to circle around to attack the convoy from a different angle. The German pilot was clever, staying low, using the sun's position to make himself harder to spot. Davies dove toward the bomber, building speed, trying to position himself on the Stuka's tail. But the German pilot saw him coming and immediately threw his aircraft into a tight turn, tighter than Davies expected. The Fulmar's turn radius was good, but with his speed advantage, Davies overshot slightly, ending up abeam of the Stuka rather than behind it. For a brief moment, the 2 aircraft were flying parallel, perhaps 50 yards apart, close enough that Davies could clearly see the German pilot looking directly at him. The moment stretched impossibly long. Davies saw a young face, probably no older than Morrison, with blonde hair visible under the leather helmet. The German pilot's expression was a mixture of fear and determination, the look of a man who knew he was probably going to die but was committed to completing his mission regardless. Their eyes met across the empty air, and Davies saw the same thing he'd see in any mirror. A warrior doing his duty, scared but pressing on because that's what duty demanded. The moment broke. The German pilot hauled his aircraft around in another tight turn, heading away from the convoy, apparently deciding survival was more important than completing his attack run. Davies let him go, turning his attention to more immediate threats. He'd learned long ago not to pursue every target, that sometimes discretion meant better overall results. 3 Stukas were forming up together, their pilots clearly coordinating an attack. That was the real threat. "All remaining aircraft," Davies transmitted. "We have 3 bandits forming up bearing 190. They're organizing for a coordinated attack. Priority target. Converge on my position." The British fighters, now reduced to 8, including Davies himself, turned toward the threat. The 3 Stukas had climbed slightly, perhaps 2,000 feet above the convoy, positioning themselves for simultaneous dive attacks that would split the defensive fire and increase their chances of scoring hits. Hartford was closest to the German formation. Davies watched as the young pilot positioned himself perfectly, climbing slightly above the Stukas before rolling into a diving attack that brought him onto the tail of the trailing bomber. Hartford's gunnery was textbook perfect, short bursts that conserved ammunition while maximizing accuracy. The Stuka's rear gunner returned fire desperately, but Hartford was weaving slightly, making himself a difficult target while keeping his own guns on target. Strikes walked up the Stuka's fuselage, and suddenly the bomber's tail section separated, tumbling away. The Stuka entered an uncontrollable flat spin, rotating faster and faster as it fell. 2 parachutes blossomed white against the blue sky as the crew bailed out. The remaining 2 Stukas broke their formation immediately, their coordinated attack plan abandoned. One dove toward the sea, building speed to escape, while the other rolled into an immediate attack dive, its pilot apparently deciding his best chance was to press home the attack while the British fighters were scattered. Davies cursed, knowing he was too far out of position to intercept effectively. But another Fulmar was perfectly placed, a pilot named Richards, who had been quiet throughout the engagement but whose flying Davies had always respected. Richards' Fulmar dropped like a stone, building tremendous speed in a nearly vertical dive that matched the Stuka's attack angle. The range closed with frightening rapidity, both aircraft plummeting toward the ships below. At 6,000 feet, Richards opened fire, his tracers reaching out toward the diving Stuka. The German rear gunner returned fire, and Davies saw strikes on Richards' Fulmar, pieces flying off the engine cowling. But Richards held his dive, continuing to fire, walking his shots toward the Stuka's vital areas. At 4,000 feet, the Stuka shuddered under multiple hits. Its dive wavered but continued. 3,000 feet. 2,000 feet. The convoy's anti-aircraft guns had opened fire now, black puffs of flak appearing around both aircraft. It was becoming a race between Richard's guns, the Stuka's determination, and the rapidly approaching water. At 1,500 feet, Richard scored a critical hit. The Stuka's engine exploded in flames, and the bomber rolled inverted, its dive becoming truly uncontrollable. The German pilot tried to roll back upright, but was too low. The Stuka impacted the water with tremendous force, sending up a geyser of white spray. Richards pulled up hard, fighting the G-forces that pressed him into his seat, his vision graying at the edges as blood drained from his brain. His Fulmar leveled off barely 200 feet above the water, so low that Davies could see the spray from its propeller wash hitting the waves. The damaged engine was smoking badly, but Richards nursed it carefully, beginning a gentle climb back toward altitude. "That was brilliant flying," Davies muttered, watching the damaged Fulmar struggle upward. The engagement was winding down now. The scattered Stukas that remained were fleeing, their formation completely broken, their attack thwarted. Davies did a quick visual count. He could see 4 Stukas heading away at full speed, staying low to make interception difficult. The sky around the convoy was marked with smoke trails and the fading contrails of the dogfight, but the ships below continued on their course, undamaged. Not a single bomb had hit its target. "All aircraft," Davies transmitted, breaking off engagement. "Return to ship. Do not pursue. Repeat, do not pursue." He knew his pilots, knew that some of them would want to chase down the fleeing German bombers, but pursuit would take them far from the convoy and leave the ships vulnerable if additional attacks materialized. Discipline was more important than revenge. The acknowledgments came back, some grudging, but all compliant. As the British fighters reformed and headed back toward the Ark Royal, Davies took stock of the engagement. They'd started with 12 fighters, lost 1 to mechanical failure, and sent another home damaged, but still combat capable. Against 18 Stukas, they'd destroyed what he estimated to be 14 German bombers, possibly 15. The remaining Stukas were scattered and fleeing, their attack completely disrupted. Most importantly, the convoy remained intact, every ship still steaming toward its destination. Ellis tapped Davies on the shoulder, pointing toward the horizon. Davies looked and saw the Ark Royal, still maintaining its course, its deck crew already preparing to recover aircraft. The ship looked beautiful to him at that moment, a haven of relative safety after the violence of combat. As they began their approach pattern, Davies allowed himself a moment of relief. They'd done it. Against the odds, outnumbered in flying aircraft that weren't optimized for fighter combat, they'd turned back a major attack and saved the convoy. The landing sequence began, each Fulmar coming aboard in order of fuel state, those lowest on fuel landing first. Wright's damaged aircraft had made it back and was already on deck, mechanics swarming over it to assess the damage. Morrison's slightly buckled wing was visible as his Fulmar landed, the aircraft settling onto the deck slightly askew before the arresting wire caught and brought it to a halt. Richards landed next, his smoking engine coughing and sputtering. The moment his aircraft stopped, fire crews rushed forward with extinguishers, dousing the engine compartment in foam before any flames could develop. When Davies' turn came, the landing felt almost anticlimactic. The deck rushed up, the arresting hook caught, and suddenly he was stopped, the adrenaline beginning to fade and leaving exhaustion in its wake. He sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed, before climbing out stiffly. Ellis emerged from the rear cockpit, his face pale but composed. "That was close, sir," the radio operator said quietly. "Too bloody close," Davies agreed. The debriefing took 3 hours. Every pilot gave their account of the engagement, their observations, their successes and mistakes. Intelligence officers took notes frantically, asking detailed questions about tactics, about the Stuka's defensive capabilities, about what had worked and what hadn't. The squadron had performed brilliantly, but Davies was already thinking about what they could improve. The initial approach had been good, but their ammunition management needed work. Some pilots had run dry before the engagement ended, leaving them effectively toothless if additional threats had appeared. The next morning, Davies stood once again on the flight deck, this time with a mug of strong coffee warming his hands. The convoy was still visible on the horizon, still steaming safely toward North Africa with its vital cargo. In his quarters, he had orders to write a detailed after-action report, a document that would be studied carefully by tacticians and strategists. What he'd witnessed yesterday was more than just a successful engagement. It was proof that carrier-based fighters could effectively defend against determined dive bomber attacks, that proper tactics and aggressive interception could neutralize the Stuka's fearsome reputation. Hartford joined him at the rail, the young pilot looking tired but satisfied. "Morning, sir," Hartford said, sipping his own coffee. "I've been thinking about yesterday, about how we approached the attack. What if we'd had radar warning? We could have intercepted them further out, maybe broken up their formation before they even got close to the convoy." Davies nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. This engagement was essentially a meeting encounter. With better early warning, we could have positioned ourselves more advantageously." The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Peters, the intelligence officer, who'd brought Davies the initial warning. "Sir," Peters said, holding a decoded message, "this just came through from the Admiralty. They're requesting your report as priority traffic. Apparently, word of yesterday's engagement has already reached London." Davies took the message, scanning it quickly. There was more. The Admiralty wanted detailed tactical recommendations, wanted to know if the engagement proved that carriers could operate effectively in the Mediterranean despite the concentration of enemy air power. The implications were significant. Davies realized that what had seemed like just another combat action to him and his pilots was being viewed at the highest levels as a potential turning point in carrier doctrine. The successful defense of the convoy against such a strong dive bomber force with minimal British losses was exactly the kind of evidence the Admiralty needed to justify continued carrier operations in contested waters. His report wouldn't just be a routine after-action summary. It would influence strategy and tactics across the entire fleet. Over the next several weeks, as the Ark Royal continued its operations, Davies refined his tactical approach based on the lessons from that engagement. He emphasized the importance of altitude advantage, of breaking up enemy formations before they could begin coordinated attacks, of ammunition discipline and mutual support. The squadron trained relentlessly, practicing intercepts, gunnery, and formation flying until the tactics became second nature. Word of the engagement spread through the fleet. Other carrier squadrons requested copies of Davies's report, studied the tactics, incorporated the lessons into their own training. The engagement became a case study, analyzed in detail at staff colleges and planning sessions. What had been an improvised response to an unexpected threat became the foundation for a systematic approach to fleet air defense. Months later, Davies received a letter from the Admiralty. His tactical report had been so influential that it was being used as the basis for a revised carrier air defense doctrine across the entire Royal Navy. The engagement that day, the interception of 18 Stukas by his undermanned squadron, was cited as proof that aggressive, well-coordinated fighter defense could protect naval forces even against heavy air attack. The letter commended his leadership and tactical insight, but Davies felt uncomfortable with the praise. He'd simply done what the situation demanded, using the resources available and the courage of his pilots. The final paragraph of the letter mentioned something that made Davies pause. The tactical innovations demonstrated during the engagement, the letter stated, represent a fundamental shift in naval air warfare doctrine. The successful defense proved that carrier-based fighters, properly employed, could neutralize the threat of dive bombers that had seemed so invincible just months before. This victory, achieved against significant odds, has provided the evidence needed to justify continued and expanded carrier operations in contested waters. The implications for future naval strategy cannot be overstated. Davies folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his logbook. Around him, the Ark Royal continued its operations, aircraft launching and recovering in the endless cycle of carrier warfare. His squadron was preparing for another patrol, another day of protecting the ships that carried the supplies and men that kept the war effort alive. The letter from the Admiralty was gratifying, but what mattered more to Davies was simpler and more immediate. His pilots were alive, the ships they protected were safe, and they'd proven something important, that courage, training, and sound tactics could overcome numerical odds. As he climbed into his cockpit for another patrol, Davies thought about that moment during the engagement when he'd locked eyes with the young German pilot. Two warriors, both scared, both determined, both caught up in something larger than themselves. The German pilot had survived that day, had turned away and escaped. Davies hoped he'd made it home safely, hoped he was sitting somewhere writing his own report, sharing his own lessons learned. War was terrible and necessary, but there was no need to hate the individual men fighting it. They were all just trying to survive, trying to do their duty, hoping to see home again. The Fulmer's engine roared to life, and Davies ran through his pre-flight checks automatically, his hands moving with practiced precision. Ellis settled into the rear cockpit, giving a thumbs up when his equipment checks were complete. The deck officer signaled, and Davies released the brakes, the fighter rolling forward toward the catapult. In moments, they'd be airborne again, climbing into the endless Mediterranean sky, ready to face whatever threats emerged. The engagement that May morning in 1941 lasted less than half an hour, but its impact resonated far beyond those violent minutes. It proved that carrier fighters could defend against massed dive bomber attacks, demonstrated the importance of aggressive interception tactics, and provided the tactical framework that would guide fleet air defense for years to come. The men who flew that day, outnumbered but undaunted, had written a chapter in military aviation history that would be studied for generations. But for Davies and his pilots, it was something simpler and more profound. It was proof that training, courage, and determination could overcome fear and long odds. It was validation that their sacrifices, their long hours of practice, their commitment to excellence mattered. Most importantly, it was confirmation that they could protect those who depended on them, that they could be the shield that stood between the convoy and destruction. The weeks following the engagement brought changes to the squadron. New pilots arrived, fresh from training schools in Britain, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear when they heard the stories of the Stuka interception. Davies took each one aside personally, walking them through the tactical decisions, explaining not just what had worked, but why it had worked. The young men listened intently, taking notes, asking questions, trying to absorb lessons that had been learned at such high cost. Hartford became Davies' unofficial second-in-command. his natural leadership ability and combat prowess making him the obvious choice. The young pilot had matured visibly during that engagement, the responsibility of combat forging something harder and more focused from the eager youngster who'd first reported to the squadron. Davies watched him briefing newer pilots, saw how Hartford balanced confidence with caution, how he emphasized the importance of teamwork and mutual support over individual heroics. Richards, whose dramatic interception had saved the convoy from at least one bomb hit, received a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. The ceremony was held on the Ark Royal's hangar deck. The entire ship's company assembled to witness the Admiral pin the medal to Richards' uniform. But Davies noticed that Richards seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention, deflecting praise to his wingmen and the mechanics who'd kept his aircraft flying. That humility, Davies reflected, was the mark of a truly dangerous fighter pilot, someone who understood that survival in combat required constant vigilance and a realistic assessment of one's abilities. Morrison, the young pilot who'd pressed his attack to such dangerous limits, received counseling from Davies about risk management. The kid had shown tremendous courage, no question about that, but courage without judgment was a quick path to a watery grave. They sat in Davies' small office, the older pilot trying to find the right balance between praising Morrison's aggression and cautioning about unnecessary risks. "You did well," Davies told him honestly. "Your determination broke up that attack run and probably saved lives, but you came within seconds of losing control at too low an altitude to recover. Next time, think about whether pressing that extra second is worth the risk of losing a trained pilot and aircraft." Morrison nodded soberly, accepting the critique without defensiveness. The convoy they'd protected reached North Africa safely, its cargo of supplies arriving exactly when needed to support a major offensive operation. Davies never learned the specifics of how those supplies were used, but months later he received a letter from an Army captain who'd been with the forces that received the convoy's cargo. "Your action that day," the captain wrote, "allowed us to continue operations that would have been impossible without those supplies. Men who would have run out of ammunition had the bullets they needed. Tanks that would have sat immobile had the fuel to advance. Medical supplies reached field hospitals in time to save lives that would otherwise have been lost. You and your pilots may never know the full extent of what your courage accomplished, but please know that it mattered greatly." Davies kept that letter, reading it on difficult nights when the losses mounted and the war seemed endless. It served as a reminder that their actions had consequences beyond the immediate tactical victory, that protecting those ships meant protecting the men who depended on what those ships carried. Every convoy defended, every bomber shot down, every attack disrupted, contributed to something larger than any single engagement. The tactical doctrine that emerged from the engagement spread throughout the fleet with remarkable speed. Other carrier commanders read Davies' report and began implementing similar approaches. The emphasis on aggressive interception, on breaking up bomber formations before they could establish their attack runs, became standard procedure. Training programs were modified to incorporate the lessons learned, with new pilots spending more time practicing high-side attacks and deflection shooting. The engagement became a benchmark, a gold standard that other squadrons strove to emulate. But success bred new challenges. The Germans learned from their losses as quickly as the British learned from their victories. Subsequent Stuka attacks included heavier fighter escorts, more dispersed formations, and approach routes designed to complicate interception. The cat-and-mouse game of tactical innovation and counter-innovation continued, each side adapting to the other's methods. Davies found himself constantly revising his tactics, incorporating new lessons, discarding approaches that no longer worked against evolved enemy tactics. 6 months after the famous engagement, Davies was summoned to a planning conference in Alexandria. Senior officers from across the Mediterranean theater gathered to discuss carrier operations and fighter tactics. Davies found himself seated at a table with men whose names he'd only read in dispatches, commanders of other carriers and air groups, staff officers responsible for operational planning. His after-action report was distributed to everyone present, and much of the discussion centered on the tactical principles it contained. A Rear Admiral Davies had never met, stood up, and addressed the assembled officers. "What Lieutenant Commander Davies and his squadron achieved that May morning represents a fundamental shift in how we approach fleet air defense," the Admiral stated. Before that engagement, there was considerable doubt about whether carrier fighters could effectively counter massed dive bomber attacks. Some argued that carriers were too vulnerable in contested waters, that they should be withdrawn to safer areas and used only for strikes against shore targets. Davies' squadron proved those doubts unfounded. They demonstrated that, with proper tactics, adequate training, and aggressive leadership, carrier fighters could defend their fleet against significant air threats. The Admiral continued, outlining how the tactical principles from the engagement were being incorporated into fleet-wide doctrine. Emphasis on altitude advantage, priority targeting of bombers over fighters when the choice existed, coordinated attacks to overwhelm enemy defensive fire. Ammunition discipline to extend combat effectiveness. These weren't revolutionary concepts individually, but the engagement had proven their effectiveness when properly integrated into a coherent tactical system. During a break in the conference, an older commander approached Davies. Commander William Foster had been flying fighters since the previous war and commanded the air group on another carrier. "I read your report 3 times, Foster told Davies. "What impressed me most wasn't the tactics themselves, which were sound, but your emphasis on the human element. You mentioned checking on your pilot's mental state, ensuring they understood not just what to do, but why to do it, building confidence through training and preparation. Too many commanders focus exclusively on the technical aspects and forget that we're sending young men into life-or-death situations. The technical skills mean nothing if the pilot freezes under pressure." Davies appreciated Foster's insight. He'd spent considerable time thinking about the psychological aspects of combat, about how to help young pilots manage fear without letting it paralyze them. The engagement with the Stukas had reinforced those thoughts. He'd seen pilots who maintained perfect technical proficiency under fire and others who'd frozen momentarily, their training overridden by primal fear. Understanding how to build resilience, how to help men push through that fear, was as important as teaching them gunnery and tactics. The conference concluded with new operational directives that would govern carrier operations throughout the Mediterranean. Davies' role in shaping those directives was significant, though he'd have preferred to simply return to his squadron and continue his work there. But leadership sometimes meant accepting responsibilities beyond one's comfort zone, meant sharing hard-won knowledge so others could benefit from it. On his return to the Ark Royal, Davies found his squadron had been busy in his absence. They'd flown multiple patrols, intercepted several reconnaissance aircraft, and covered 2 more convoys without incident. Hartford had commanded the squadron during Davies' absence and had done an excellent job, handling situations with the same balanced judgment Davies tried to model. The squadron was becoming something special, Davies realized, a unit where every pilot understood his role, where mutual trust and confidence enabled them to function as a coordinated team rather than a collection of individuals. But the war continued its grinding progression, and casualties were inevitable. 3 weeks after Davies returned from Alexandria, they lost their first pilot since the Stuka engagement. Lieutenant Andrews, a capable pilot who'd been with the squadron for 8 months, was shot down during a patrol by a German fighter that approached from out of the sun. His radio operator managed to bail out and was rescued by a destroyer, but Andrews went down with his aircraft. The loss hit the squadron hard, a reminder that their luck and skill couldn't protect them indefinitely. Davies wrote the letter to Andrews' family personally, as he did for every man lost under his command. It was the hardest part of leadership, trying to find words that could somehow comfort grieving parents or a widow, trying to convey that their son or husband had mattered, that his service and sacrifice meant something beyond the terrible fact of his death. Davies struggled with these letters, often drafting and redrafting multiple times, never feeling that the words were adequate, but knowing they were necessary. The squadron held a small memorial service on the hangar deck, the ship's chaplain leading prayers while the assembled pilots stood at attention. Davies said a few words about Andrews, about his dedication and professionalism, about how he'd always been ready to help newer pilots or take on the difficult assignments without complaint. Afterward, the pilots dispersed quietly, each man contemplating his own mortality, wondering if the next mission would be his last. But they continued flying. That was what separated those who could handle combat from those who couldn't, the ability to process grief and fear and then climb back into the cockpit and do the job that needed doing. Davies watched his pilots carefully in the days after Andrews' death, looking for signs of excessive stress or declining confidence. A pilot who'd lost his nerve was a danger to himself and his squadron, but to his relief, the men processed their grief and returned to duty with the same professionalism they'd always shown. As 1941 turned into 1942, the character of the air war changed. The Germans introduced new fighter types with better performance, forcing Davies to constantly revise his tactics. The Fulmar, which had served them well, was beginning to show its age, its performance marginal against the latest enemy fighters. Rumors circulated about new British fighters being developed, faster and more capable aircraft that would restore the performance advantage. Davies hoped those rumors were true. His pilot's skill could compensate for some performance disadvantage, but there were limits to what training and tactics could overcome. The Ark Royal itself would not survive to see those new fighters. In November 1941, the carrier was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank while under tow. Davies and his squadron had transferred to another carrier weeks before, spared the trauma of losing their ship. But the news still hit hard. The Ark Royal had been their home, the platform from which they'd achieved their greatest victory. Its loss felt personal, like losing a family member. Years later, after the war had ended and Davies had returned to civilian life, he attended a reunion of Ark Royal veterans. Old men now, gray-haired and slower, they gathered to remember the ship and the days when they had been young and had faced death daily. Hartford was there, having survived the war and returned to his family's business. Richards attended, walking with a slight limp from injuries sustained in a later engagement. Morrison came, now a commercial airline pilot, his daring channeled into safer pursuits. They talked late into the night, sharing memories, laughing at stories that had seemed terrifying at the time but had been softened by the passage of years. Someone asked Davies about the Stuka engagement, wanted to hear his perspective again after all this time. Davies thought carefully before responding. "What I remember most," he said finally, "isn't the tactics, or the shooting, or even the fear. What I remember is the absolute trust we had in each other. Every pilot knew that his wingman would be there, that if he got into trouble, someone would come to help. That trust, that confidence in each other, was what made everything else possible. We were good pilots individually, but we were great as a team. That's what I want people to remember about that day." The engagement with the Stukas became one of those moments that defined not just the participants, but influenced everyone who came after. Young pilots, training in the years that followed, studied the engagement, learned its lessons, tried to emulate the tactical excellence that had been demonstrated that May morning. The doctrine that emerged from it shaped naval aviation tactics for decades, influencing how carrier air defense was conducted through subsequent conflicts. But perhaps the most important legacy was simpler and more human. The engagement proved that ordinary men, properly trained and led, could achieve extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. Davies and his pilots hadn't been superhuman. They'd been scared, uncertain, flying aircraft that weren't ideally suited for the mission they'd been given, but they'd had good training, sound tactics, mutual trust, and the courage to press forward despite their fear. Those qualities, combined with a measure of good fortune, had been enough to turn the tide of what could have been a devastating attack. In the end, that was what military history was really about, not the grand strategic movements or the decisions made by generals and admirals in comfortable headquarters, but the actions of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances who did what needed doing because it was their duty and because their comrades depended on them. The engagement that day had been one small action in a vast global conflict, but for the men who flew it and the sailors on the ships they protected, it had been everything. And the ripples from that action, the tactical innovations and doctrinal changes and simple inspiration it provided, spread far beyond that single morning, touching countless lives and influencing events that none of the participants could have foreseen. Davies died in 1983, an old man surrounded by his family, his warriors long behind him but never forgotten. His obituary mentioned the distinguished service order he'd received, his post-war career in aviation, his contributions to his community. But to those who knew him best, what mattered most was simpler. He'd been a man who'd done his duty when it mattered, who'd led by example, who'd brought his men home when he could and mourned those he couldn't. In his desk drawer, his family found the letter from that Army captain, creased and worn from many readings, a reminder of why the sacrifices had mattered. Next to it was a photograph of his squadron, taken on the Ark Royal's deck before the famous engagement, young faces full of confidence and hope, unaware of what was coming but ready to face it together. That photograph, more than any medal or commendation, captured what had made that day possible and what made it worth remembering.